I think we're live, hopefully. Hi. So we are live on Tuesday. It is Thursday and it is 4 p.m. GMT. And we are very pleased to welcome Graham Phillips onto the show today. He's a journalist and blogger who's currently in the south of Ukraine. And he's actually just returned from Crimea, where he's been covering events there. He's now writing an ebook about his experiences driving around Ukraine for the 10 days leading up to the controversial referendum in Crimea, where voters just voted to form a union with Russia. That ebook is going to be called Driving to the Breakup of Ukraine. I will put some more information about that in the description below, and we'll also put some links to Graham's website and to his YouTube channel where you can check out some of the footage that he's filmed in Crimea. So Graham, it's lovely to have you on the show today. Which part of Ukraine are you actually in right now?
I'm in the south of Ukraine. I don't like to be too specific sometimes about location because I'm on a couple of blacklists with groups that I've spoken at. I gave an interview in Crimea, basically defending their right to effectively a referendum of secession on the basis that on the basis that the groups that are now empowering Kiev's government are very strongly right-wing, terrorist, really anti-Crimea organizations that give them, I think, in Crimea, justification to want not to be a part of this new Ukraine that we have, of course, with far-right sectors playing a very powerful role in the new administrative setup. So in terms of my location, you know, I move around Ukraine quite a lot. I mean, the last 10 days, I've driven about 10 days, about 2,500 miles to really get a mood of Ukraine in the sort of week to what really was the breakup of Ukraine as we know it, as we understood it as a country.
So you've just returned from Crimea. Maybe you could just explain to our viewers, you know, what you sort of saw on the ground while you were there. I think you were there for the actual referendum, weren't you?
I was. I mean, yeah, it was weird. I mean, I'd been to Crimea 2 weeks before when things were just starting. So this was a couple of weeks ago. This was the end of February, basically, when the Russian forces, as they are described, although at the time there was some uncertainty, I think we can effectively say that that was a de facto Russian force operation that took over the airports there at Simferopol and the parliament in Sevastopol. And I was there for that time, and you know, to come back 2 weeks later, and it's been tumultuous, absolutely tumultuous 2 weeks for Crimea. They've gone from all this description of them as being occupied, but I mean, what I saw at that time was actually a mood of them feeling that they were being liberated, if you like, because it was just after Viktor Yanukovych had been ejected from the country, and of course he actually went to Crimea. Spend a little bit of time before his departure to the nearby Rostov-on-Don, and Crimea was really then just starting to kick out and starting to reject and rebel against this new system of government in Ukraine and Kiev, and so you had a Russian checkpoint going into Crimea at that time. There were Russian flying. There was a huge mass Russia demonstration in Sevastopol that was there that night, flags and Cossacks and concert and all that kind of thing. And then also it was kind of mirrored by sort of movements of military vehicles. So I mean, driving around Crimea at that time, and at that time it was quite covert would be the word, because it wasn't really known outside the peninsula what was going on. No one really knew who these guys were that were around the parliament, and that then driving through the night there were huge convoys of Russians moving through, how many of them there were, where exactly they'd come from. So it was all a kind of a brave, if you like, or perhaps for some people, at least it was perceived in the Western media, quite a scary new world. But in Crimea, the mood was really one of celebration. And of course, then they had the referendum set at that time for May the 25th. Then they moved it forward to March the 30th. And then they moved it forward again to March the 16th, which was, of course, just there Sunday. And I was there just for that. I wanted to return to be a part of that referendum. And it came as sort of the final call, if you like, of my having driven, as I say, around 2,500 miles, visiting Kherson, Odessa, Nikolaev, Donetsk, Lugansk, Mariupol, just reeling off a list of cities mostly in the east of Ukraine, Kharkiv, to get a mood of what the feeling in Ukraine was at really what was a historic week for the country of coming up to now 23 years, 22 and a half years, as it effectively entered endgame, if you can call it that, as a whole nation. It was a bit surreal. You know, I was driving along and you're hearing all the radio adverts for Ukraine as one country, and you're seeing billboards for Ukraine as one country, and then you go to Crimea and you see the billboards there for Ukraine. They're all faded and they're all torn, and it was all suddenly billboards for Russia. Vote Russia, we want to be with Russia. And the mood in the rest of Ukraine had got pretty conflicted, pretty unsettled, pretty turbulent, and in some cases almost, you can say, terrifying, as much as in Donetsk and Kharkiv. There had been violent conflicts just a few hours after I left those cities where people had actually been killed. There was huge fear and uncertainty, and then to kind of cross into Crimea, and then you're kind of coming into a celebration of what they see as a referendum, giving them what a man told me he'd been waiting for 23 years, which is their independence, their reunification, as described with the Russian Federation, their secession, and their, if you like, referendum, which then returned, of course, 97%. And I visited polling stations. I wanted to be sure, of course, that this referendum was being fairly done, was being conducted upon a proper basis. So I went to polling stations. I spoke to hundreds and hundreds of people in Crimea, including Tatars. I really left feeling that I had an idea, a true idea of that situation, of those circumstances in Crimea. And I came to share the feeling that it was a victory, and it was a triumph, if you can call it that, for them, against a government which, of course, the next night sent senior members of Svoboda, one of its key parties, into a television station, a state TV channel, to violently assault its chief executive officer and demand his resignation live on air. So it's frightening, the new Ukraine. It's if you're not a part of what they see as being their Ukraine, which Crimea isn't, and it really made that clear that it doesn't want it. I mean, there's posters up calling the Ukrainians fascists and calling the governments neo-Nazis, and there's also monuments to their Soviet soldiers, proudly venerated, proudly respected all across the peninsula. And they see this in Crimea as, in some ways, having been the new fight against fascism 60 years on, in fact, of course, almost 70 years on in certain cases. So to them, this is really a cause for celebration. And I left Crimea feeling that's something which I shared in terms of those sentiments.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I should just quickly apologise that we started the interview late. We were having some technical problems, as always happens with these live interviews, but I've just noticed some of you guys in the comments asking when it's going to be starting and things like that. But obviously we are live now, and please get your questions in for Graham. Obviously he's on the ground in Ukraine there, so knows a lot more about the situation than we do from our studio in London. So get your questions coming in and we'll try and ask as many as we can. But Graham, obviously the referendum has been really controversial in the West. And I think from the outside looking in, lots of people were kind of asking, well, if the referendum is a fair one, why is it being so rushed and rolled out so quickly? I think you were saying that the date kept getting moved forwards. Could you maybe give your views on that?
Well, the situation in Ukraine as it stands is changing every single second at the moment. It feels it's in a complete state of flux. I mean, it's moving so quickly that there really isn't any kind of sense of setting a yardstick and saying that that's something which will be adhered to, and that's something which will stand in this Ukraine, which is just feels like it's moving a million tweets an hour. And literally, I saw a figure that on YouTube there's now something like 100,000 videos on YouTube, millions and millions of tweets. It's the main theatre of action in the world, and it's evolving, and it's radically just completely kind of revolutionising in terms of its movement. And of course, today we've had really the order for Ukraine to remove its troops from Crimea. So, you set a date in this new Ukraine, and it very quickly can be stripped of meaning. I mean, of course, we go back to the February the 21st agreement that Viktor Yanukovych signed with the ministers and with the opposition ministers. Now, he signed that, it was the early evening of Friday, February the 21st. And that was an agreement that there was going to be a peace restored to Ukraine, there was going to be certain concessions made, and it was a compromise to effectively restore order in a country which had really fallen into chaos. A few hours later, he'd had to flee the country, his home was being raided, and the deal was completely disregarded, torn up, and you had a new government that was forming itself in Kiev less than 24 hours. Tymoshenko, of course, was released at that point. And then the next day, statues were toppling of Lenin all across Ukraine. So it gives you an idea. And of course, in that day, we also had the speaker appointed, Alexander Turchinov, who then became the president of Ukraine in just a few short moments in Ukraine. So in terms of setting a referendum, May the 25th was originally to coordinate with the presidential referendum, but the sentiment in Crimea was so strong that they do not want to be a part of this new Ukraine. And let's remember that this new government that was formed, it isn't democratic. It wasn't formed on the basis of an election, and that was one thing that Yanukovych left or fled, as he says, fearing for his life, chased out of Ukraine. But what they did, and he was elected, of course, back in 2010, so his presidential election, the new one, was in any case scheduled for early 2015. But what the government did next, the new government, as we call them, was sweep away a ruling party, the Party of Regions, that was actually elected just back in 2012. So they got rid of Yanukovych, and then almost as a given, swept away the government, the Party of Regions government that was formed in 2012 on the basis of elections which were described as fair, not perfect, but fair elections. So New Ukraine moves so quickly that you set a date and it can immediately seem irrelevant in the scheme of things in the current climate that we're in.
Mm-hmm. And Graham, I've got a question here from a viewer called 10 items or less, and they've said, do you have any idea whether Russia will stop with Crimea or will they continue to expand further into Ukraine?
Right. Well, this is
what your thoughts have been on the ground.
That's a really good question, and I put that question. I spoke to hundreds of Ukrainians around Ukraine, and I must admit, I came to the east of Ukraine. I've been there before. I mean, it's Laura, to think that I was at these places back in Euro 2012, and we were talking about a couple of years ago. Ukraine was preparing for a showpiece tournament, which was really going to set itself up as a country which is capable of hosting a major spectacle, a modern, progressive European country, which was really going to set out a benchmark as to its status by hosting Euro 2012, which it did, and it did pretty successfully. So the last time that I've been to Donetsk was in Euro 2012. Kharkiv was a few months before, around that time also. And I, coming to them again, did have an idea of these as being pretty pro-Russian countries. And I'd heard, obviously, and read about Russian flags being raised in both of these cities. The mood in the ground is a little other, though. Even in Donetsk, which is a bastion of pro-Russia sentiment, of course, it's very close to Russia, to the border. It's right to the east. And Kharkiv, in fact, is only 25 miles from Russia. But the mood, you can't say that is a universally Russian mood. I spoke to people on the ground there that really felt pro-Ukrainian, and this is what the kind of after effect of Euromaidan is it's almost put Ukrainians into camps. And there are those that have gone to the Russia side that really do want to ally with Russia and be with Russia, but there are also equally those that have been pro-Ukrainian-ized, if you will, and have really kind of come out with their colours and have said that we're Ukrainians and we don't want to be a part. Now in Donetsk, possibly 65% of the people I spoke to, 60-65% were pro-Russian and would really be happy to be a part of Russia, but there was a strong contingent who really didn't want that, who really wanted to be a part of Ukraine. And I even spoke to two women in the space of a couple of meters. One of them was in the Lenin Square in Donetsk shouting that this is Russia, and the other shouting it's Ukraine. So what you see all over the country at the moment is Ukrainian conflict with each other. I spoke to couples, a couple in Lugansk, the guys for Ukraine, the girls for Russia. In Lugansk, incidentally, which directly borders Russia, that was the strongest pro-Russian sentiment. And when you go to something like Lugansk, which is right on Russia, it's a city of around 500,000 right in the east, then you really see how little relevance, if you like, or application that the concept of the EU has to something like that, which all the signs are in Russian. And of course, Russian is the language of that part of the country. If you go from Odessa, and in fact even from Kiev east, it's almost a universal Russian-speaking culture, certainly in the cities, that is. But a lot of people said to me, we speak Russian, but we're not Russians and we don't want to be a part of Russia. And in Dnipropetrovsk, which is, of course, where Tymoshenko was from, it's actually where a lot of previous Ukrainian leaders have come from, and it was once a closed Soviet munitions city. They've actually demolished their Lenin statue, and it's now daubed in Ukrainian colours. These Nebesna Sotna, which is in Russian the Heavenly 100 men who died in Euromaidan. There was also a tribute there to the fallen police officers. But you do get a real mixed sentiment. You do get people, and it's not down the ages. You get old people that want to be a part of Ukraine. and you get young people that want to be a part of Russia. I spoke to 2 girls in Lugansk, about 17, who just said to me, Russia's better. I spoke to an older man in Kherson, which is in the southeast of Ukraine, and he said that he supports the Pravy sector, which is, of course, Ukraine's far right. Many describe it as a terrorist operation, virulently anti-Russia. So you get a sense of a country of conflict. There's a lot of people unhappy, and the most sentiment is that even if people are pro-Ukrainian, they're unhappy with this current administration. It's a government which is really satisfying almost no one in Ukraine. That's pushed some people towards Russia. Some people are still really resisting and clinging to this Ukraine sentiment in the East. But there's a sense all around of a country which is kind of in a state of almost being torn apart. I feel that if you go to Lugansk, and if you go to a little bit below that, Mariupol in the south, which is again bordering Russia, you could probably say that those 2 cities, combined population of 1 million area, more of course, that they would join Russia without too much protest. But if you go to Kharkiv and Donetsk, it would cause huge ruptions and repercussions, because there would be those strongly fighting on both sides. And in Donetsk and Kharkiv last week, we saw people killed, actually, for the first time outside of Kiev and Crimea since Euromaidan started back in November. So, I mean, blood is being spilled now across the country, and you do have a sense that this is a country which now has lost its sense of identity. But it's more than that. It's lost its sense of being able to go along, of being able to live with each other and feel as one, as Ukrainians. Before, who felt they were perhaps pro-Russian, but they also were subsumed under this sense of Ukraine. That feels like it's been shattered now.
And Graham, what are the thoughts of people on the ground in Ukraine and Crimea about what Western governments have been doing in response to all of this?
Well, in Crimea, I mean, to contrast that mood, I'd just been in Dnipropetrovsk before, and I went down, drove a couple of 100 miles, and Dnipropetrovsk was despondent, and it was conflicted with itself in terms of who it was. And it was an uneasy city. It was wondering if violence was going to spread to it from the nearby rather, Kharkiv and Donetsk. And you go to Crimea, and it was really joyous, and it was happy, and it was anti what they see as interference from America, interference from the EU. There were signs up saying that, you know, Americans, we don't kill our own, we protect our heroes, and of course the killing your own is a reference to the fact that many people believe that America backed a Euromaidan, which has of course been accused of effectively killing its own activists in conflict. So they really are anti this, what they see as interference in their right to self-determination in Crimea. They really don't want any. And there was a woman that held up a sign that said, it's ironic, isn't it, is that when you call joining the EU, when you speak about joining the EU, it's integration, and yet when you speak about joining Russia, it's occupation. So there's a lot of feeling there of double standards being applied, and of hypocrisy from the West, and unwanted interference in what they see as their business and their right to define who they are as a people and as a country.
Thank you, Graham. So I've got another question from a viewer here. They're called Slytherin, and they've said, I know it's unprofessional for a journalist to make reports based on his opinion, but I will ask for it nonetheless. Who, in your opinion, has more right to control Crimea, disregarding the referendum? I would like to hear your view on the situation because it's a fresh look from outside. But they put, if you don't want to state your own opinion, what do people in the European Union think about the situation? And he says he means ordinary people on the ground, not related to businesses and governments.
Sure. I'm really happy to give my opinion on this, and that's on the basis that I feel that in this situation we've seen so many changes, but we've seen changes in even the role of journalism and the role of journalists. So many journalists were pro-Euromaidan. I'm talking about journalists from the Kiev Post, Promansky, Channel 5, Ukrainsky Pravda. So many journalists abandoned, and of course this journalist Tatiana Chernovil, who was beaten up back in December, had been she'd been one of the ones involved in the actual violent clashes against police, and she's a journalist. So I always feel in this that you've had a sense of the role of a journalist changing to the sort of sense of journalist activist. So I've never really had an issue with giving my opinion on matters as I see them. And in this, I fully support the Crimean right to self-determination. And as for the election, I can say that having visited polling stations and spoken to Crimeans, and also I'm talking about Crimean Tatars, that it reflects what they want. It reflects their wishes, and it reflects, I would also go further and say, their right. So my opinion there was that I was happy and I supported them, and I felt, even if this perhaps isn't too much of a personal thing, I felt quite proud to be there on what felt like a momentous day and an occasion, and really one that was, for them, scenes of jubilation. So to be a part of that was something which resonated with me. And in my opinion, they do have the right. They did have the right to make that choice. It was a fair choice, and what you see now is Ukraine even accepting that decision. And this is coming in the new Ukraine that we're in, and it's surreal to think that a month ago now, we're talking now March the 20th, a month ago Viktor Yanukovych was still in power, and Ukraine was together, and now Ukraine is fissured and fractured, and they've lost Crimea, and it isn't ever coming back. Ukraine, and I live in Ukraine, and I feel sad for Ukrainians that that's the situation, that they've lost Crimea, which is really, you could say, it's the best part of Ukraine. It's 26,000 kilometers, a little more, of their richest agriculture, of their key tourist attractions, of their most bountiful land, and some of their most beautiful cities and locations. So 6 million tourists a year. It's very hard for them to lose it. So I feel some sympathy. But I also feel strongly opposed. And the government now in power is really orchestrated by a far-right party called Svoboda. Now, I've been speaking out against Svoboda since 2012, and that has something which has borne out my writings in 2012. This is a neo-Nazi fascist party, and that they've now come to power is something I find in Ukraine deeply, deeply worrying, unsettling, and almost to me sometimes baffling that the Western world is willing to accept this far-right party with members of the Pravi sect, even further right, described as terrorist organization, and yet in Crimea the EU and the US don't accept what was a peaceful referendum. There was no blood spilled on the day. There were reports, of course, of a Ukrainian soldier killed yesterday, but it passed off peacefully and calmly. And let's remember that this was a referendum. The new government in Kiev at the moment wasn't elected, it wasn't democratic, and there was no referendum. And that's simply for a reason that the parties who wanted to control Ukraine knew that they couldn't do so on that basis. So my opinion on the matter as a person is that I'm happy for Crimea. I feel that they've made a decision which is backed up and borne out by the current situation in Ukraine, and they've respected what they see as their heritage, their history, and their heroes, and I'm at one with that.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think it is that Western governments seem to be so keen to wholeheartedly embrace this new government without acknowledging the more extremist elements of it? I mean, John Kerry from America flew over there a few days ago and gave the new government his full support, and they're offering them economic support as well. Do you think it's really just as simple as a kind of new Cold War battle, and that's why they're not willing to acknowledge it, because then it might lend support to Russia? Or?
Well, absolutely, that's the case. And John Kerry speaks like he's got no idea about Ukraine. He speaks about Ukrainian people like he's got no concept of the fact that we're talking about a country whose politics are so diametrically opposed to each other. And that's really something that you can see in terms of the heroes of the country, which is from the West, a historical figure called Stepan Bandera, who is reviled, and there are statues of him all across the west of Ukraine. He is reviled in the East, and in fact they call in the East these people from Lviv and from the west of Ukraine Banderites, which is a synonym for fascists and for neo-Nazis. And what you also have is, in the East, is these Lenin statues, which in some cities have been destroyed, and they accuse people of having come from the West and having destroyed their history and their monuments. So it's a divided country. When John Kerry speaks about people, you do get the sense that he really has no clear idea of what he's talking about. And in fact, it's unclear if John Kerry has indeed ever been to Crimea. And if you went to Crimea, you would see, in fact, a country that was historically a part of Russia. It was given, of course, by Khrushchev, the president, 60 years ago, which was controversial at the time. But we're also talking about a country that was a massive movement for reunification with Russia. 20 years ago, in 1993, there was talk of a breakaway. So this isn't a new thing that's happened in Crimea, but this is almost the new Ukraine, that they've been able to kick away from a system, from a country which has really collapsed, and that they've really kicked away from that. And in terms of linking with Russia, there's actually now a bridge being built. What the Western reaction hasn't taken into account is the wishes of these people in the reality of the new situation in Ukraine. It's myopic. And if you look at the Twitter accounts of, for example, Jeffrey Pyatt, who's the US ambassador to Ukraine, then I almost found myself staggered reading through his tweets, which were talking about these brave protesters, these Euromaidan protesters who had been killed. And there was almost no reference to the fact that these guys were attacking police with guns, with Molotov cocktails. They killed 16 policemen. And the American description of them is still as peaceful protesters. They go to pay tribute to these men who killed their own countrymen and who were killed, who were at war with each other. And the only word that I can come back to this is it's completely myopic, and it's staggeringly misguided. And it almost feels like they've got their knowledge from Ukraine from scanning the first paragraph of Wikipedia. I mean, this is not a foreign policy which has any resonance or relevance when you actually come and feel Ukraine as it is on the ground. And the US policy has been incredibly misguided and misplaced throughout. And I'm talking about from the beginning of Euromaidan.
Unfortunately, I think we're going to have to start wrapping things up, which is a shame because it's so interesting hearing everything you have to say. But perhaps just one last question, Graham. It'd be great to hear your thoughts. And you said that the situation is just moving so quick, but are there any predictions you feel like you can make about what's going to happen next?
Well, you know, I'll go on Twitter after this, and I guarantee you in my feed there'll be another, several hundred tweets about Ukraine, and they'll all be kicking the situation on, and they'll all be, and there's so much information out there that you have to disseminate what's real. I mean, there's talk, of course, of Russian troops as massed all over the place in these invasions and incursions, and then, hours pass and it comes that it's not the case. It's worrying. It's worrying that you have the Pravi sector of Ukraine, this far-right operation, who are so powerful and who have really declared war against Russia through their websites, through their activists. They're really espousing these warmongering sentiments that they want to fight, they want to kill Russians. And yesterday you had a seismic step, which was that Russians are now going to have visas to enter Ukraine, which is something which was almost incomprehensible. This visa-free regime between Ukraine and Russia goes back so long. In fact, there's never been a system as of this nature before that is going to impose visas on two countries who so many people told me in the week see each other as brothers. And when I spoke to Ukrainian soldiers near the border, these guys are Russian-speaking. These guys are not themselves anti-Russian. I spoke to Russian soldiers, also Russian-speaking, and not anti-Ukrainian as they see it, but anti the new Ukraine that they see as being a direct attack on them. So for me, the tragedy would be if soldiers go to war about this when they're essentially one people. The worry is that movements such as Svoboda and the Pravi sector, the right sector, have become so powerful that they're not going to stop until blood is spilled, until they've attacked, and they're talking about smashing pipelines, Russia pipelines running through Ukraine. So I can't, unfortunately, sit here and say that I see that there's going to be a peaceful resolution to this, because there are just so many factions now. And let's come back to Kiev. There's barricades still there. They haven't moved barricades. You've got guys, thousands of young men around Ukraine now with guns that they took during Euromaidan, but also more than that in Ukraine. You do have a feeling, a slight sense of anarchy here. And perhaps the most pressing thing of all is the need for a leader is one that is abundantly absent. There's no clear leader that brings Ukrainians together, that has a vision, that unites Ukraine, what there is of it now, to come together, to resolve this, to settle their issues, and to move forward in a peaceful way. There's no one that's doing that, and there's no leader that seems to have that capacity to mend and to heal this country, which is in a state of turmoil at the moment. And I don't want to doom-monger, but I can't see a peaceful solution, and I can't see any way at the moment that this situation really gets better. So that is unfortunately a negative and a pessimistic message, but that is how it is here.
Well, thank you so much for all your time. It's, as I said, it's been so interesting hearing what you've had to say, and it would be great to maybe get you back on again in the future when I'm sure.
Thanks for the questions. Thanks for the questions.
Amounts of stuff will have happened. For those of you guys watching, we'll put links to Graham's website and his YouTube channel in the description below. They're not there right now, but we'll put them in straight afterwards. So be sure to check those out. And this has been Truth Loader Live. Thank you very much for watching.
Thanks very much, guys. I appreciate that.